Welcome to our summer school spotlight. Today we're absolutely thrilled to have Melanie Reinhart, who's a guest tutor at our summer school this year. And I'm sure that Melanie doesn't really need an introduction, but for those that don't know Melanie, Melanie is a patron at the Faculty of Astrological Studies and a prize-winning diploma holder. Astrology has been central to Melanie's life since 1959, and she's been a professional astrologer since 1975, offering consultations, writing, and she teaches in the UK and abroad. And I think most people will know you from this book, Melanie, which I have to say has really set the stage, and it's probably one of the most influential books in establishing Chiron. So Melanie, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Kerry. It's delightful to do one of my favorite things, which is to talk about astrology. So thanks for the opportunity.
No problem. And so you'll be joining us for another summer school, which we're absolutely thrilled about, as are our students. And you're doing a couple of talks on Saturn in Pisces, is that right?
Yes, that's right. And Saturn's something I always really enjoy talking about, because, you know, as in terms of the whole planetary pantheon, Saturn is certainly one of the planets that gets bad press.
Yes.
And in a way, Chiron has become another one.
Yeah.
And so while it would be foolish to try and whitewash just how difficult and uncomfortable a Saturn transit can be, it's far from the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to do a bit of reframing on that to round out the picture of what Saturn really is about in the horoscope, our own horoscope, and then also by transit. And so I'll be doing two sessions on Saturn, actually. In the second one, I'll probably offer a guided imagery type of exercise.
Oh, wow.
But at any rate, the second session will be to do with our own personal journey with Saturn, as I say, possibly via a guided imagery process, but certainly looking at our own charts. Oh, and I want to mention something about this. A couple of days after I do that, and those sessions are back to back, so it's almost like a mini workshop.
Yeah.
And a couple of days later, my dear friend and colleague in the faculty, Darby Costello, she's also doing a double act.
Yeah, she is.
On Saturn. And when we were talking on the phone a few days ago, the idea came. It's almost like so Jupiter's now in Gemini, and both Darby and myself are Gemini Sun.
Brilliant.
I suddenly thought, this is like a metalogue. So that's one of my favorite words. I'm always looking for somehow to bring it in. I first heard the word in the work of Gregory Bateson, a very wonderful philosopher. And so the word means that which we are speaking about is also arising. When I first read that, I was electrified, because I thought, oh my God, that's exactly what happens with astrology.
Yeah.
What we are speaking about arises, meaning, and I'm sure probably any student listening to this will know this and understand it from experience. Once you start really focusing in on something and really studying it, it seems to show itself all around you. And this is such an interesting way, an interesting part of the astrology learning process, you know, where you learn to spot the metalogs. So it makes for a really, really exciting process. Then, of course, the reverse is also true. So, yes, what we're speaking about is also arising. But in astrology, we also speak about that which is arising. So that's the complement of it.
Yeah.
And so So we enjoyed that little joke,
Mm.
the metalog about Gemini. So I'd want to say, you know, anybody who's got a Gemini emphasis in their horoscope, with Jupiter going through it, you're definitely going to want to see and attend both. It's
Yeah.
always both and two where there's Gemini. So that was really cool.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. Yeah. And you'll be doing your meditations as well, won't you?
Oh, yes. Yes, I
Which
will.
is always very popular.
Well, it's lovely that it is. And, you know, how that came about, I'll tell you how it came about, is some years back, the faculty did a program in Bali.
Mm.
And being a tropical climate, you know, the sun, but by 6 in the morning, the sun is already out.
Mm.
And so on that program, we had an early morning yoga session every day to start the day. And it was such a nice way to start the day. So I think we started at 6.
Right.
And we did some astrological yoga, which was a practice that I had kind of didn't deliberately create. It just sort of occurred, you know.
Yeah.
And it was so lovely. And obviously, you know, here it's a different climate and the weather's not reliable. So 6 o'clock in the morning, even in August, we could all be miserably cold.
Yeah.
And so it didn't transfer.
Mm-hmm.
But I then thought, well, there must be something else that we could do in the morning to kind of enter the astrological day in a way that supports the reason that we're there anyway.
Yeah.
And then I suddenly thought about the fact that, of course, you know, traditionally the days of the week, each one has its own planetary ruler.
Yeah.
And that's also, you know, by the way, that's another marvelous thing to include in your studies, to be aware of which planetary ruler is ruling the day.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember when I was studying, I used to orient my studies around that sometimes.
Oh, that's good.
You know, like on Monday, I would study the moon.
Mm.
On Tuesday, I would study Mars. And so it went on. So anyway, I, for a very long time, had been hugely inspired by the Orphic hymns of the planets. And in particular, the translation by this marvelous man called Thomas Taylor, who was a true lover of the classics. And you can see by the language, which of course today it has a wonderful archaic ring to it, at least I love it. And you can tell the depth of the man's, you know, reverence for the ancient gods and his connection with all of the gods that represent the cosmos and our place in it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I suggested maybe we could have a short session, it's only half an hour, in the morning where the planet ruling the day and the ode to that planet from the translation of Thomas Taylor is read.
Right.
And people do seem to really enjoy it. I certainly do. It's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, we do get some great feedback from that. It's just such a
Oh,
nice.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, we
great.
do. Yeah. Yeah, it is. So that'll be lovely. So we're all looking forward to that.
Oh, great. Well, me too. I always look forward to that.
So we've asked our students if they had any questions for you. We did get quite a lot of questions, so it would take too long to go through them all. So we will just ask a few.
That's great. And I think that's a great idea, by the way, to, you know, involve the students with their
Yeah.
questions. That's excellent. Wonderful.
So let's dive in then. So our first question is from a student who's asked, what inspired you or made you feel drawn to doing deep research on Chiron?
Yeah, that's fairly easy to answer. I was always interested in various things to do with healing, partly because I had really quite a number of quite serious health challenges when I was growing up, including a major fall where I broke the bone up that goes up into the shoulder and ended up in a full body cast.
Oh no.
For months and months and months because the wound wouldn't heal.
Right.
Phew, that's
Yeah.
a central mythic image. So I was also interested in mythology, and I wasn't somebody who, you know, like researched a whole lot of myths, and I didn't take a scholarly approach. I just kind of followed my nose in terms of what appealed to me or what spoke to me personally. So I had heard of Chiron already, and the notion of the wounded healer was already meaningful for me in my life because, you know, I had this major wound in my shoulder, you know. And partly as a result of that, I also became involved in learning about hands-on healing and even practicing it when I was really, really young. I apprenticed with a spiritual healer who was also a medium and a clairvoyant.
Right.
It was like my very first mentor. I was only 14.
Wow.
So those themes were already a major part of my life.
Yeah.
So when Chiron was discovered, unusually, it was named immediately. Because typically what happens is, first it's given a classification number according to what kind of object it is. And then, you know, names can be proposed. And it can even happen that years go by before the official naming discussion and so on comes up on the agenda of the International Astronomical Union, which is the international body that sees to things like the naming and numbering of the planets and all of that. But it was named immediately by the guy who actually discovered it when he spotted on a photographic plate. So it was the first observation. And he made the connection immediately because of where Chiron was discovered. So that was discovered in between Saturn and Uranus. So unusually also, this astronomer called Charles Kowal also was quite knowledgeable about mythology. And so he figured that this new body needed to be called something which referred to both Saturn and Uranus because it was discovered between them. And so it was called Chiron. Well, in fact, I think originally it was called slow-moving cometary object Kowal, named after him. So in the early observations, that's how you'll see it referred to. And then, of course, it went through a kind of a shape-shifting process almost, because at that time it was an object that was unique unto itself. There was nothing else like it in the solar system that had been found up to that point. So 1977 was when it was discovered. And so it was first called a planetoid, meaning planet-like, and then an asteroid, and then a comet, and it still has all of those classifications. So it's kind of a multi-description type of object.
Yeah.
Which seems very significant. And then as of about 1992, when the Kuiper Belt was discovered, they began discovering other objects that behaved in a similar way to Chiron. And so the subcategory called the centaurs was created. But back to the question. So I was already drawn to Chiron just when it was named, because I thought, wow, there is this object that has this mythic connection to a theme that's already a big part of my life. And of course, it took about 6 months for the first ephemerises to come out and be available. And so, of course, you know, naturally, I looked at where it was in my chart. And I saw that it was in a very close opposition to my sun.
Right.
And visually kind of a bit stuck out on its own. So I casually thought, well, you know, if this is going to be something meaningful to explore, it should somehow show. Because I realized, so Chiron was discovered in early Taurus. And I soon realized that it was about to make conjunctions by transit with every single one of my personal planets,
Right.
which all lie between Taurus and Gemini.
Wow.
So again, I casually thought, well, you know, if this is going to be meaningful, it should show up in my life.
Yeah.
With these transits. So, you know, I sort of thought, well, all I have to do is, you know, keep my journal ready and just make a note of what happens. I had no idea what was coming down the tracks for me, and it would take way too long to explain, but it was the most profound inner journey that lasted for years. It lasted pretty much the duration of all those transits.
Right.
And in fact, then eventually the book, which Kerry showed you the cover of, that was published right around the time of the final transit in that whole sequence. And I was completely immersed in the process of exploring and discovering for years and years and years, you know. And to be honest, a lot of that was me kind of scrambling, trying to find language and concepts and so forth to understand something of what was happening to me, to moi, in my own life. And eventually, well, I began researching just, you know, in collections of charts and so forth. And I didn't immediately put them into any client horoscopes because I had no idea what to say. But then I started putting them in, putting Chiron into all the chart clients I saw, but without saying anything and just observing and listening. And then it got really bizarre. How it felt. It felt sometimes like the universe was sending me all these people to teach me about how Chiron worked.
Wow.
Because the stories, and you know, unmistakable in terms of the symbolism, especially if you have some experience of or sense of how the process of our own wounding and suffering and so on, how that is an integral part of our life's journey. Nobody has a pain-free life.
No.
Nobody goes through life without suffering to one degree or another. And sometimes that suffering is also part of a kind of awakening to a new way of looking at life, to a genuinely expanded consciousness and awareness. So it's like we can see the suffering as part of a process of, you know, like a caterpillar who spins a little cocoon and then lives in there in this closed space for a while until its whole body liquefies, and then it becomes a butterfly, which breaks out of the chrysalis and flies away. And I know that's a cliche image, but it so works to describe the process of our own spiritual unfoldment.
Yeah.
And, you know, along the way, there can be many life experiences and lessons, in quotes, that we encounter, which can feel pretty all-consuming in terms of how much they hurt and how much pain there is. And so one can't ignore that with Chiron, but one can learn ways of, as it were, accompanying oneself through that, almost a kind of self-mentoring process, so that the process can unfold to the furthest extent that it's trying to, kind of thing. And you don't have to have studied Chiron to have some feeling for that.
Yeah.
That is how the healing process works. And so, having been in such a deep process myself, and having a stream of clients who I'm eternally grateful to, because it was from them that I just saw example after example how the process works. And then in all that time, it never occurred to me to write a book. Never. I wouldn't have thought I could, for one. And secondly, I was too engaged in my own process with Chiron transits. And so many years into all that, when by that time I had like boxes of research material, all taken from real life examples. And then now, Howard Susportis was a close personal friend of mine, and lived in the same area of London as I then did. And so we would meet up and talk shop and have lunch and stuff like that. And one day he phoned me up and said, how about writing a book on Chiron? Because he knew I had all this material, because we would talk about Chiron. And I was sort of stunned because I'd never thought of it. And he had been given by his then publisher a project to find new authors and new titles. So he thought of me. And I was a bit thrown by the idea. And then he said, well, I'll tell you what, just write us 100 words. And I can do that. Then he had a meeting with his publishers, came back to me and said, well, now they want 500 words. I like that. Want 500 words. So that's not too bad, did that. And then the third thing was, he said, okay, now they want a chapter structure. So I said to Howard, but how on earth do you write a chapter structure when you haven't written the book? And I'll never forget this. Howard was an Aries with a lot of other fire in his chart as well. And his sun in Aries was exactly conjunct my North Node in the 6th house, as in hard work.
Oh, wow.
And when I said, oh, but how do you do this when you haven't written the book? And in a very typically Aries way, he just said, oh, for God's sake, just do it.
I love that.
And so I sat down. It was very early days of computers. Now we're talking mid-1980s. I sat down at the computer and I just thought, okay, if there was a book on Chiron that I wanted to read in order to clarify my own understanding and learn some stuff, what would it have to have in it? So I went chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, part 1, part 2, etc. And with one minor change, that ended up being the structure of the whole book, because I got a contract on the basis of that. And of course, then I had to write the book, which meant completely reorganizing my whole life, so that was the sole focus, which I kept that up for 18 months without a break.
Wow.
And I finished the thing on time and everything, etc. So that's incredibly long answer to the question.
Oh, yeah, an amazing answer. What an amazing answer. Yeah.
So that's how it all happened. And
Incredible.
truly, I had never thought of writing a book, but I did, you know.
Yeah, and we're very glad that you did.
Oh, bless you.
Okay, so another student is curious as to which house system you use and why.
Okay. So I use the Koch houses.
Okay.
And the reason I do that is because at the stage in my astrology journey, when you know, when one becomes aware that there's this bewildering number
Yes.
of different house systems that
Yeah.
give you slightly different readings and all that. And I think initially we all set out to try and find the right one.
Yeah.
And of course that's a hopeless endeavor because there is no right one.
Yeah.
But there is a sort of a resonance that people have with a particular house system. And that would be a fascinating study in itself, like how come different people are drawn to different house
Yes, it would,
systems.
wouldn't it?
One could go into the astronomy and the symbology and so on and so forth. But at the time, I was reading a lot of the work of the wonderful astrologer Stephen Arroyo. I think I read all his books. And now I can't quote you chapter and verse as to which book he says this in. But he uses the Koch houses. And the reason he gave was that he said that he'd found the transits to the house cusps to be very revealing and very accurate.
Right.
So I thought, oh, well, that's easy enough to try it.
Mm.
I was already, I can't remember what I started off using, probably Placidus, because that's a very popular one.
Yeah.
But through when I was reading Stephen Arroyo, I started experimenting with the Koch. And the number of, you know, bingos and lights flashing that I got by looking at the transits, it was so ridiculously accurate in terms of events in people's lives. Not that astrology is all about events. And here I can't resist a quote from Dane Rudhyar, or maybe a paraphrase, because I read this a long time ago. But anyway, Rudhyar's notion is that events do not happen to people. People happen to events. In other words, the experience of an event is as much about what we bring to it and what we do with it as the event itself. And I always loved that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I pretty soon saw with the house cusps. And, you know, if any of you are curious about that, I do invite you to try that. And, you know, it can be accurate even down to really mundane kind of things in one's life. Like some years ago, I joined a gym for the first time in my life. And I always was terrified of gym classes when I was a kid. All this terrifying equipment and everybody who was so muscular and strong, and I always felt so weak. Them charging around, oh, it was a nightmare. So already that was a little out of character. Also, it was the first time. And it was so striking. I just like made the decision and then, you know, went and signed up and started, you know. And I thought, this is too weird. I must have a look at my transits. And wouldn't you know it, Uranus was on the cusp of my 6th house.
Wow.
On the very day where I had this aha and reaction on it. And that was when it was in Aries. So I just laughed. I thought, yeah, it really works, this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's a fun thing to check, you know. But that's the reason that I first started using it. And I've sort of stuck with that. But I have to say, you know, if somebody comes to me for a reading, and perhaps they're an astrology student or even a professional, and they have a real attachment to using
particular, yeah,
you know, another house system.
Yeah.
That's the one that they feel comfortable with. I'm perfectly fine if they want
Yeah.
to read their chart in another house system. However, I always also do it in Koch.
Yeah.
Just for comparison. And I have had some very interesting experiences.
Oh.
Just having the two there together. Because in the conversation with somebody, you may hear an emphasis that's not in, doesn't show in the house system that somebody's used to using.
Mm.
In which case it might be appropriate to just mention, well, you know, if we put up your chart in the car, it looks like this, or that emphasis moves into a different part of the chart, which sort of suggests blah, blah, blah kind of thing. And I've had some quite dramatic experiences with clients where suddenly a light is shone on a slightly different area of their life. And of course, thereby bringing awareness to it.
Yeah.
Then the insights can flow and the connections can be made. So I tend to be a bit fluid with that. And I don't mind sort of mixing and matching. I also think it's a really cool reminder that no matter how intelligently we kind of divide things up, you know, with houses and all the rest of it, to me, it's a reminder that this is actually a symbolic language that we are learning how to speak.
Yeah.
As it were. And so for me, it's a waste of energy to try to get like the right house system or the right interpretation. Because in the world of symbolism, things are much more fluid.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of people do get hung up on the house systems, don't they? Like you say, when they start out and they just, you know, they're obsessed with this.
Oh, there are many, many things about astrology.
Yeah.
Which one can get obsessed with having to find the right way, the right interpretation, the right method, the right, all these things. And of course, you know, there is merit in the desire to explore.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And it's often an expression of our wish to be the best astrologers we possibly can be. But very, very often it's in the relaxation of that kind of very rigid, fixed ways that the true magic of astrology begins to speak to us. So it's not us who do all the figuring out. That's a stage we go through, but it's not the whole journey, you know.
Absolutely.
And learning to listen, listen within to what's coming forth from your own intuition, or even sometimes, you know, if you're discussing a chart with somebody, you know, they can start having their own intuitions as well, which is equally valuable. So one way or another, astrology is speaking.
Yeah.
And it's a whole different thing than finding the right way. And at least that's been my experience.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Okay, so what else do we have? So, have you got anything to say about the forthcoming Saturn-Neptune conjunction?
Oh, yes. I'm very interested in that because, so I know that the conjunction between Saturn and Neptune, it doesn't, so technically it doesn't become exact until February of 2026. So that sounds to me like that's quite far ahead.
Yeah.
However, if you just take Neptune and Saturn and you track their movements relative to each other, and both literally where they are in the zodiac, but also thematically, you will see that the energy of that conjunction is definitely already well underway. For example, this summer, this so-called summer, I'm speaking from the UK, and we've had so little sun, it's ridiculous. I feel cheated. Anyway, this summer, Neptune hangs about in the very final degree of Pisces for weeks and weeks and weeks. Okay. So given that Neptune is one of the major players in the dyad, now that has to be significant. We can also see that Neptune and Saturn do their turning points. So they go from direct to retrograde and eventually back again in dates that are quite close together. So if you look at a visual of that, the lines are turning direction at the same time this year and again next year, when both of them peep into Aries, just a tiny sliver. So all the way through next summer, that's 2025, they are already well in the orb of conjunction, because they're in the same degree. But in terms of them being exact, that only happens in the February of 2026. So it's a very interesting pattern where the themes and the energies that are represented by Neptune and Saturn, well, the whole cosmos is already firing on those cylinders. So the thing to do with that is make yourself a roadmap, especially if you've got any planets at early on in the cardinal signs, then that conjunction will be setting those planets resonating. So make yourself a roadmap, or find out how to use the graphic ephemeris, and just in one glance you'll see the whole movement of it. Pay attention to the stations of the planets where they change direction, and also when either Saturn or Neptune winds up conjunct or opposite the Sun. So those are the markers in the year as this whole extraordinary unfolding occurs. And you know, when something comes to a conjunction, the time before that represents the ending of a cycle, because the conjunction marks the beginning of a new cycle. And so this is a very strong marker of endings and beginnings, doubled up by the fact that it's Pisces, the very last sign of the zodiac, and Aries, the very first one. So the whole wave, I think it's appropriate to speak about waves because it's Neptune, the king of the sea. Whole wave is like going between endings and beginnings. Now, absolutely, definitely, all the way through next year as well. And then there will be a gear change in February of 2026. But in the meantime, the major theme is almost about, you know, the discernment about what is of the old cycle and is being washed away, kind of whether we like it or not. And so the process of recognizing that and helping ourselves to let go of what's past and what belongs to the outgoing cycle, as well as welcoming in the new. And there, part of the quirk is, of course, the new may not be in as clear a form as we would like. So the new might not be a project that we can, you know, open up a journal page for and say, okay, here's the strategy. You know, stage 1, stage 2, and this and that. You can't be strategic around Neptune. It doesn't go very well. And yet Saturn works best when one is being strategic. So this is the paradox that we all have to hold. And, you know, the art of letting go, it's a very subtle one, also very strong. There might be pain, grief, regret, relief, whole mix of different feelings when we realize that we're transitioning into a new stage of our lives. And I think part of the secret, as it were, is to just give it the time that it needs. And even remembering the fact that these two planets are heading into Aries, that itself can be helpful. Because I think what not to do is to rush it and get impatient and try to sort of get this new thing up and going as quickly as we can, and then find ourselves, you know, having made mistakes or gone too far down that garden path before you really looked and before you'd seen the roadmap or whatever. And so I think there's great virtue in patience during this whole process. And many qualities can come to accompany that as well. Like there's a certain amount of trust which is required. And there, I don't mean a Pollyanna kind of trust that everything is going to be okay and no problems. And we don't know that. But as we develop our capacity to bear with and hold with our own experience, that alone can turn something from an experience where we're full of reactivity and therefore totally not enjoying it or totally defensive against it or something, can turn from that kind of energy into a kind of wonder and a curiosity. It's like, wow, what's going to happen next? Or what is this? So a curiosity is a huge ally during processes where the unknown is featured, and it certainly is at the moment. There's a lot of washing away going on, a lot of things that are kind of collapsing. So it's quite a collapsing kind of energy, Saturn conjunct Neptune. By the way, the end of the cycle that I'm referring to is one that began in 1989. So those of you who are old enough to remember, it might be worth just checking out. So what was going on for you in the late 1980s? And in what way was that period of time new beginning for you? And did you see it at the time, or did you not know and you were terrified? And just explore that, because the events of a huge world-changing nature occurred right around that point. For example, there were 3 conjunctions in Capricorn in 1989, and a few days, 2 or 3 days after the last one, the Berlin Wall came down. And about 6 weeks after that, Nelson Mandela was released from jail after 28 years, a whole cycle of Saturn, right? Released. So this is not only about subtle states of mind and soul. It can be dramatic external events as well. But that is one of the beauties of the astrological perspective, is that one can see the kind of unifying threads that can run through experiences which might seem very different on the face of it, but once you connect with the astrological signification, it invites us to consider the world as interconnected in myriad of ways, way more than we could ever understand, really. But the feeling of things being interconnected, that I think is a core realization when you study astrology. As usual, I've rambled way off topic.
No, it's absolutely wonderful answer. Okay, what else do we have? So what advice would you give someone having a difficult Chiron transit?
Okay, so a couple of things which I have already said. But I mean, firstly, I think there's no formula. Everybody's experience of their Chiron transits are going to be unique.
Yeah.
And so I would always hesitate to say, oh, well, if you're going to have a transit of Chiron to your moon or your Mercury and so on. The truth is that if you observe your own experience closely enough, and that includes observing the life processes of people you're closely connected to, or even looking up biographies of people who you're interested in, celebrities or historical figures and so forth, what you'll see is that if you honor your own understanding of the basic alphabet that we all learn when we first learn astrology, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, etc., and something about their significations and indeed their processes of refinement and expression and so forth. And if you add to that your understanding of the process of healing and what that entails, and the spiritual purpose of it as well, well, the whole picture will start coming into view. Now, that doesn't mean that any sense of difficulty or pain or suffering just gets magicked away. Far from it. But there's something about the capacity to bear with, sit with, to endure, to encompass, to accompany yourself. That's like, that muscle gets developed if we're willing. Because if we aren't willing to do that, then our own reactivity against our own experience will build up. And then we might get spun off into the blame and shame and blame game. And there's a lot of that around in the collective at the moment. And so if you can see that your Chiron transit, difficult though it may be, is also bringing opportunities to learn about these more subtle things that go on within your own soul, and the huge amount of healing and benefit that can come from that.
Yeah.
And that's still not to deny any of the levels of pain that we might go through on the way. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And one more from the student. For those that are new to astrology, what would you say are the key benefits of studying astrology?
Oh gosh, there's so many. Well, first of all, I should declare my hand here. I initially did all my astrological studies completely on my own. So I went from zero to being a professional without ever having attended a class.
Wow.
Or had a teacher. Now don't ask me how I did that. But that's what happened.
Wow.
Due to life circumstances and other things. And then once I came to live in London, that was when I joined the faculty and did their course, the certificate and diploma and all that. So I like to think I did everything backwards. my own natal Mercury retrograde in the 8th house, so kind of hidden away and going backwards.
Backwards, yeah.
But you know, I never regretted that. Well, certainly I never regretted taking the time and devoting the energy to working through the faculty courses. And the other huge advantage of that was, of course, joining the faculty community. Hugely valuable. So I just wanted there to make a contrast between, you know, there are aspects of one's own astrological journey where I think I'm going to say where one has to do it alone. You have to fly solo, or at least be willing to do some of that. And this will vary by people's natural temperament, you know. And then there is the community side to it, especially during the learning process, which can be just a wonder.
Yeah.
You know, when I did the faculty course, there were no live classes at that stage. It was by correspondence only. And in those days, it was letter writing.
Right. Wow.
And then the first time I came to London and went to an astrology workshop, that was 1978. I met a fellow astrology student who was also doing the faculty class. I mean, amazing. And we became friends, and we still are.
Oh, that's lovely.
And we created these little kind of teaching dyads, and we would make a day of it. And so we'd apportion out different parts of the class, I mean the lessons, and agree, well, okay, you know, you do this bit and I'll do that bit. And then we would get together and teach each other what we had just learned. So I still remember we did that so well with the harmonics and midpoints. And now I think that's an option.
Yeah.
In the course schedule, but back then it was compulsory.
Right.
So I forget who did which, but that worked so well.
Yeah, it's great.
We had so much fun. And you know, there's that phrase, if you want to learn something, try to teach it.
Yeah.
Absolutely worked. So there is the element of community and this feeling of everybody being involved in a whole journey of exploration.
Yeah.
And I absolutely want to mention the book that the faculty published called A Journey with Astrology. And there's a number of astrologers, so it's an anthology kind of centered around people's individual journey in astrology.
Yeah.
So all people who've been involved with the faculty, and of course all completely different.
Yes.
And I love that book, you know.
Yeah.
I was totally honored they asked me to write something. And it's so lovely, well, that I know most of the people who did the writing, and I knew something about their lives, and to see it in a book. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And it really is a journey.
It is, yeah.
And it's a journey which has very ancient roots, because, you know, astrology has been the lingua franca, as it were, of many wisdom traditions down the ages, which factor in our relationship to the cosmos that we inhabit. So, I mean, that's such a refreshing, broad view of what life is about. I mean, that is such an incredible gift, because if you really get that, it's going to alter your values and what's important to you, how you think, and the choices you make will be against this background. And a lovely paradox. By studying, you know, personal horoscopes, especially one's own, there's like a laser beam of light that can give you very sharp, like putting it under a microscope is putting your life under a microscope, which can be hugely challenging and absolutely marvelous at the same time, because you get to focus on your own self in a way that I think there are very few other disciplines that can do that the way astrology does it. Okay.
Yeah.
And as of course, some people would dismiss that as just being self-obsessed and navel-gazing and all the rest of it. But with astrology, all that's in the context of the profound and deep significance of the individual in the greater cosmos. And so there's a reciprocality between, you know, the minutiae of my own life and the great cosmos of which we are all part. So in other words, there's both an emphasis on the individual, and there's also a recognition that we are but small bit players in the grand drama of the whole cosmos. And neither should predominate. And the paradox is something very enlivening, you know. And yeah, so many benefits, can't even think of them all.
Yeah, there is.
But certainly, you know, my many astrological friends, oh, so wonderful. And it's so possible to be really supportive to one's own friends, astro friends, by maybe having a shared session with your horoscopes together, and that kind of thing, because we're given a language with which to articulate very deep aspects of the human soul, you know. It's also a hugely varied field. So, you know, once we've got the basic alphabet, so to speak, and we can speak a few sentences, and we're learning the language, well, inevitably, to take it further, people will be drawn to aspects of involvement with astrology which mirrors their own temperament. And so everybody has a place. Some people are very gifted researchers, and that's what they'll want to do. You know, some, for example, have a background in history, and that their passion will be the so-called mundane astrology to do with politics and history and so forth. I unfortunately don't have much background in that. I wish I did. But you know, the inner workings of the human soul is what has always interested me, and indeed the healing potential of astrology and what it offers. So yes, many benefits. Yeah. And you know, it's hard work as well.
Yes, it is. It is hard work, and it takes a long time.
It does.
Yeah.
You know, I remember once being asked in a class, being asked by a student, how long did it take you to become a professional astrologer? And I did the maths. And the answer is 16 years.
Yeah.
And the other answer would be, of course, lifetimes. I mean, as in many lifetimes. Yeah. And, you know, obviously that answer will depend on whether or not you believe in or subscribe to the notion of reincarnation or continuity of life. But I tell you, over my years of teaching not in a formal class situation for a school, not the faculty, but I used to run my own program of workshops. And I tried to orient them so that people at any level would be able to plug in in a way that suited them. Yeah. And so what was so wonderful is there were often people would come from a wide variety of different levels of involvement with astrology, including there were 2 or 3 people who often came where they couldn't even match the signs with the symbols for the signs. They had never attended an astrology class and were virtually astrologically illiterate. But I tell you, they were plugged into the mains as regards understanding of how things work in the cosmos.
Yeah.
They had come from other spiritual traditions, some of which, you know, are not involved with astrology at all. But through their own inner work, that they'd already come to their own connection with the cosmos. And so the quality of the input that they offered during the group was amazing. And people were mind blown, you know. And I used to always joke and say, well, you know, so-and-so, she's obviously been an astrologer in another life because she gets it, you know. And that is a lovely mystery that I love to wonder about that, because of course there, you know, there can't be any firm and provable answer to such a wondering, but that is how it goes, I think.
Yeah.
At minimum, you join a long and I was going to say and honored tradition, but that's not correct. Astrology, at least in the West, has had many phases where it has not been honored.
No, that's true.
It has been vilified and persecuted. And, you know, one could endlessly debate as to whether it deserved to be persecuted. That's a whole other discussion. But it hasn't always been honored, but it is foundationally an honorable profession. And I think one of the many things that appeals to me about the faculty is that there is a commitment to furthering that sense of it being honorable.
Yeah. Yeah. You said that wonderfully.
Thank you for saying that. I paused because I thought, oh my God, I've forgotten what question I'm supposed to be answering.
So moving on to summer school again.
Yes.
Do you have any memorable experiences or insights from your past teachings at summer school?
Gosh, yes, quite a lot come flooding back. But if I start from the most recent one.
Yeah.
A few years ago, pre-COVID, when Brian Clark was coming over from Australia to attend and teach at the summer school, we were asked to do an evening together. And then came COVID, and then summer school went online, and we didn't want to do it online. So that kind of fell by the wayside. But then when we were back live in Exeter College, we were asked again. And it was very difficult because we didn't really know how to do it or what to do. And we were invited a long time before August 2023. So we had plenty of time to think about it, but it was impossible to firm up anything. And it was literally when we were both already there that we decided on how to approach it. And there were a number of really comedic spots in that evening that we did. And since childhood, I've harbored a secret ambition that I really wanted to be a stand-up comedian. And I think that evening with Brian, that's probably the closest I'll ever get in this lifetime to being a stand-up comedian, but I thought it was very funny.
Yes.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think others did as well. It was very funny.
Yeah, it was. It was.
So that's a standout memory. But then there are many little memories about things that happen in class. And of course, similar kinds of things can happen in online classes as well. But there is definitely, there's something about being there with all of us together, having the luxury, my God, of being able to focus on astrology 24/7 for a week.
Yeah.
In a context where one can be completely relaxed, because you're not having to answer awkward questions from others who are a bit suspicious
No.
or judgmental and so on. So it's a very astrology friendly context.
Yes. Yeah.
Everybody's really relaxed.
Yeah.
But there've been many little times, just the personal responses of a few seconds long, where something happens in the room, someone says something, and you can feel that everybody drops onto a deeper level. It can be 2 or 3 seconds of silence, something that small and simple, but it really touches you, touches your mind, it touches your heart. And in that sense, it can even be transformative. And for me, summer school is full of those little moments, even if they go by unremarked at the time. That that's the field. That's how it works in that field. I do remember my very first summer school, which was when it took place in Jesus College. And it was in, I think, 1990.
Right.
It was anyway, they asked me to do a weekend on Chiron. I was completely terrified. Because I kind of idealized the faculty itself as a school.
Yeah.
And, being there in Oxford in Jesus College, overwhelming to be in this ancient building where, if I stood quiet, I could feel my IQ rising as I stood quiet, what an incredible place. So I felt very timid, very unsure, and at the same time thrilled and honored to have been invited to do that. I had spoken about Chiron before, but that felt like a huge thing.
Yeah.
For me, and I still remember vividly the class and some of the people who were there. And the result was, I was kind of on the back of that. I was invited to present or teach at many summer schools since that time.
Since then,
that was the first one.
Yeah.
And even the fact it was about Chiron, because that was still during a time where hardly anybody was using Chiron. And there were still many people who thought that I was a bit mad. And the whole thing was a bit mad. And we already had enough planets, we don't need any more, and all that kind of thing. So that wasn't a recipe for feeling relaxed and at ease for me. And so to be doing that material, having been invited by the faculty, for me, it felt like a huge deal. And, everybody, it was a wonderful group, wonderful students, and I loved being there at Jesus College and so forth. One other memory just comes in. So we went from Jesus College to Brasenose College. And I still remember something where it was before the summer school had even begun. And, a few of us were sort of hanging around chatting and so on. And it was then that I learned that under the ground throughout Oxford, and specifically underneath Brasenose, at least that's how I understood it, there were miles and miles and miles of library shelves, storage shelves for some of the most valuable books on the planet, ancient manuscripts from you name it, whatever culture. And I think at that time, if I remember correctly, they said there was 40 miles of shelves underneath the ground. And I went, oh my God.
Wow.
So I went and broke the rules. I stood on the lawn and I said, oh, if I stand here long enough, maybe I'll absorb it all through my feet. But just the notion that there we were having, having our little classes and our little discussions and so on, in this venue where underneath our feet, there were miles and miles and miles of like the collected knowledge
Wow.
of human endeavor right under our feet. And that was an image. And that came back to me every time I went to summer school. And I've actually only just thought about it again now. And that was, oh, and I missed the astrology there. That was the year, that was 1995. The year that Pluto, the lord of the underworld, entered the sign of Sagittarius, to do with wisdom and learning and expanding one's understanding and all the rest of it. So I thought, it's a metalogue, here we are. And we've got, like Pluto in Sagittarius, directly expressed underneath our feet, So that was kind of memorable.
That's lovely. So thank you so much, Melanie, for sharing your wisdom and insights with us today. And we do really look forward to your sessions at summer school.
Well, thanks so much, Kerry, for inviting me to do this. As I said, one of my favorite things is just to talk astrology kind of randomly or in a class or with a friend,
Yeah.
It's all just so lovely to do.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you. And thanks for
And thank you.